Hi, I'm Gail.
And hi, I'm Catherine. And today we're delighted to have Dr. Mary Frances O'Connor as our advocate for women aging. She's a renowned grief expert, neuroscientist, and psychologist who directs the Grief, Loss, and Social Stress Lab, GLASS, at the University of Arizona. Now, over a decade, she has conducted studies to better understand what actually happens in our brain when we grieve. Dr. O'Connor's recent book, I'll show it to you, The Grieving Brain, The Surprising Science of How We Learn from Love and Loss, provides a new paradigm for understanding love, loss, and learning. So based on her own trailblazing neuroimaging work, research in the field, and real-life stories, Dr. O'Connor integrates accessible science and practical knowledge to help us understand what happens when we grieve and how to navigate loss with more ease and grace. Welcome, Dr. O'Connor. We're, again, very, very happy to have you with us.
Well, it's just delightful to be here. And just please call me Mary Frances.
Okay, thank you. We will. We will.
Frances.
Well,
Yeah.
there is so much to try to understand about grieving from the sort of the brain's perspective, and we'll do our best to get into as much as we can in the time we have allowed here. But let's start with you're a leader in the field of grief and complicated grief. So help us understand the difference.
Mhm.
Sure. The reason I like the term complicated grief, although the newer term is prolonged grief, which was recently accepted by the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual that psychiatrists and psychologists use. But the reason that I like the term complicated grief, the older term, is because it reminds me of this idea of complications. And so if you think about when you have, say, you break a bone, say, for example, you're not actually doing something to knit those cells back together again, right? You can provide support, right? You might use a cast or crutches or something, but it's really your natural healing process, isn't it? And I think of this as grief as well. Grief is the natural response to loss. And over time, that experience changes for people. But sometimes there are complications when you're broken a bone, right? So there's a second break in the same place, or you get an infection in that area. And under those circumstances, it can be really helpful to have intervention, right? To help get someone back on that natural healing trajectory. And so I think of complicated grief, prolonged grief in a similar way. There's something that's gotten in the way of the typical healing that people experience. And while, intervention is not designed to take grief away, that's not really possible, but it is. We know there are psychotherapies that help us to get back on that natural healing trajectory for people who have gone years and just really aren't experiencing any change over time.
Mm-hmm.
And you, in your book, you bring together three really important concepts: love, loss, and learning. And why bring in those three, and how do you see them as interconnected?
Well, my own research into grief and grieving has made me acutely aware that first, there's a bond that happens, right? That is really genuinely encoded physically in the brain. So when you fall in love with your spouse, you fall in love with your child, that changes the brain physically. It changes the neurons that connect together. It changes the epigenetics. And it's only because that bond exists that when that person dies, then we experience loss, we experience grief, because the we is missing, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so linking those two together really helped me to distinguish it from other kinds of experiences like something like you get rejected, right? You give a talk and you're really nervous in front of a bunch of people who have come to see the talk. Those aren't individuals that you have a bond with, right? So it's a stressful experience, but it's not the same thing. So first there's There's this bond, there's love, and then there's this experience of loss. And then the learning part really dawned on me after a long time. It really occurred to me that grieving, this process of coming to understand over time that, your loved one isn't there. You're not going to retire together, or you're, no longer, you're not going to see them graduate from high school, That is a form of learning. How do I understand how to be in the world now that I'm carrying the absence of this person with me, And so to me, learning made grieving feel a little more familiar too, because we all are learning from the moment we're born.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
So I think, neuroscience, as you know, has become very in the public eye. And but I'm not sure we all really know what goes on with neuroimaging. Can you describe that process a bit?
Sure. Yeah, it's I have great respect and just genuine gratitude for the participants who have been in the neuroimaging studies of grief that we have. And part of it is we try to explain what's going to happen, but of course they have the courage to go through, they trust us and the courage to go through these studies. So it almost always starts with an interview where we try to understand where the person is at in their grieving process, who the person was who died, and often they are participating in the study to honor their loved one, which I find to be very touching. Mm-hmm. We very often ask people to bring a photograph of the person who's died or a couple of photographs, and that gives us a better chance to see who they are, but also because when we're trying to look at the reaction in the brain, we need it to be very specifically about grief. And so one way to do that is we take this photograph that they've given us and we put it on goggles. We scan it into the computer and then display it on goggles while someone is lying in the neuroimaging scanner. And it's the same kind of scanner as, the scanner you would get a scan of your knee or a scan of your elbow or something. But this one, instead of looking at bone, is looking at blood flow. And that blood flow tells us what parts of the brain are active. And so what we're asking is what parts of the brain are active when they're looking at this person who they're grieving, who, has been this bonded part of their life and is now absent. And we compare that activity to just looking at a picture of a person, a stranger, so that we can specifically figure out how is the brain reacting specifically around grief. And so through then some very complicated statistics and analysis, we're able to look at those brain images of people who've been laying in the scanner, and we're able to look at them across a whole group of people and find out how the brain is in fact creating this experience of grief we have.
Are you able to tell from those the neuroimaging kind of what process of grief people are in or what stage of grief?
No, I wouldn't say that it's that refined.
Okay.
I think we're really at such a basic level of trying to understand how the brain creates this experience. And so we see parts of the brain that we know are important for memory, for example. That doesn't probably surprise anyone. Parts of the brain that are important for emotion, parts of the brain that are important for this thing I mentioned before about we, so taking another person's perspective, right? This seems to be an important part of what happens as we're grieving, is we have to understand what's my perspective and what was the other person's perspective. And then some areas that are often seen when people are having emotional pain, sort of that attention to this is really important, this really hurts. And so we see areas that are related to that. But we wouldn't say that one individual scan tells us very much about that individual's grief, but more how does the brain do this in general for human beings?
Okay. I was interested in your book when you talk about memory and beliefs. And one of the things you talk about is that we have two beliefs that are mutually exclusive. Can you say a bit more about
Yeah.
that?
This seems to me, this was really kind of a key understanding for me because you hear people say, people who have experienced the death of a spouse, say, for example, they'll say, gosh, I feel like they're just going to walk through the door again. Right? That's just such a familiar feeling. And they're not crazy. They can tell you, look, I know that's not actually going to happen, but it really feels like it's going to happen. And I think if you take that very seriously, that this is their experience, then I think we can figure out in the brain why that might be. And it's this, that on the one hand, you have these memories, right? You were either there at the bedside or you were caring for this person as they grew more ill and maybe saw them pass away, or you got the phone call, whatever, or went to the funeral, whatever the memories are. But on the other hand, when we bond with someone, when we fall in love, like I was describing before, there's a belief that comes along with you are now my one and only, right? And that belief is I will always be there for you and you will always be there for me. And you don't have to be in someone's physical presence for that belief to remain true, right? We kiss each other goodbye and go off to work and go off to school every day. And it's not like we think, oh, well, they may have disappeared, right? We have this very clear understanding that they will come back or we'll go get them, in some unusual circumstance. And so that belief that they're everlasting is really in conflict with this memory that we know they've died, right? And so those two things can't possibly both be true. And yet the brain is using both kinds of information. I think this is part of why it takes a long time to really start predicting their absence more than predicting their presence. And so grieving takes a long time.
Gail, do you have a comment, question at this point?
I have a lot of questions. But the idea of a complicated grief in terms of what you're discussing now, how does that fit in? What makes it different?
Oh, that's a really great question. So one of the things that we know, one of the complications that can happen is that sometimes for individuals, for people, it's so painful to think about what it means that this person is gone. It's just so overwhelming that they actually avoid thinking about it, or they avoid places that might remind them of the person, or they avoid certain conversations or certain people, right? Well, that's understandable, obviously, because it is very painful. But the downside of that is that this learning I was talking about, it requires experience, It sounds silly, but, you're not going to learn your multiplication tables if you don't practice them, right? And similarly, if you're not really engaging in this world where your loved one is not a part of it, except in that you carry them with you, if you're not engaging in the world, you don't really have a chance to learn what does it mean for me to be in the world without this person? How do I make sense of, these years we shared together, given that, I'm not making dinner for this person anymore. I'm not going to the movies with this person anymore and sharing really, common experiences. You have to learn, and avoidance can really get in the way of that learning and may in fact prolong the experience of adapting to the fact that they're not on this earthly plane.
I know from my own experience and many women that I've talked with, Gail and I know, who almost everyone talks about this phase, and there's no real time frame to it, where they have trouble thinking. They don't want to read. Reading is like, I can't read right now. I can't take in much external stimulation, and it And so I think what your book is so helpful, one of the ways is that it explains why grieving, as you said, takes such a long time,
Yeah.
and why there's no, and give yourself a year and then you'll be fine.
No.
No, no.
No, definitely not. We anticipate that a year we've started to see changes, but that doesn't mean, I mean, for one thing, you know, grief is going to be a part of your life forever because you have always lost this person who was so important to you. So whenever you become aware of that moment, in that moment that you've lost this person, of course you're going to feel grief. But that's different from grieving, right? So grief is sort of that momentary wave, but grieving means that over time, you may have that feeling of grief less frequently or less intensely, or even if it's the same in those ways, it feels familiar. You kind of know how to work around it, right? You know how to work with it. And so that to me is that change over time that sort of matters more. I sometimes say, you know, the idea that you could get over it to me is such a funny thing. It's like saying, when did you get over your wedding day?
That's right.
You know, which is the question doesn't make any sense. So when did you get over your husband dying or your sister dying? That's just not really a question that makes sense. But it will change your reaction to this terrible loss. Your reaction will change over time. And so those are a little bit different.
And then you talk about year. Oh, I'm sorry, Gail. Go ahead.
And when it's complicated,
Yeah.
or has more elements to it,
Yeah.
then that's a way of saying perhaps you need some help. Perhaps you need to talk with someone.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's some sort of specifics. So there's a set of criteria that we use to sort of determine if someone is having the kind of trouble where they would need intervention. And you know, the simplest piece is just how well are they able to do the things they want to in life. Mm-hmm. So that thing you were saying about reading, it is absolutely true that it's, you know, it's really hard to read. It's hard to focus on anything. It's hard to concentrate at work. It's hard to, you know, and over time, that experience usually changes. So it is not usually the case that someone can never read again. Right. And so if people aren't able to engage in the things that they would like to be doing, you know, they can't get dinner on the table, right? Or they literally have stopped going to do things with their friends. They've just completely stopped doing that. Then those are indications that something is not changing in the typical way. And, you know, we can develop skills, right? It's grieving is learning. And so we can develop more skills about how do you move into grief and how do you move out of it again. A good friend of mine describes it as jumping into a puddle and then jumping back out of it again. And so skills like that can really help you to both have grief and also do some of the meaningful activities in your life.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to ask you if you also talk about yearning. And is that the same as grieving, or is that the feeling of grieving?
I think of yearning really specifically as that sort of wanting wanting them to be back, right? Wanting things to be the way they were before. Some people almost experience it as physically, right? Just wanting them to be there. And so grieving is a lot of things. Grieving is you feel angry sometimes, you feel guilty sometimes, you feel confused or numb, right? All of those, I think, constitute grief. But yearning is very specifically that wanting them back, that I think of as very similar to hunger or thirst, right? Because we know our loved ones are so important to our survival. They're as important as food and water to our survival. And so I think of that yearning as like a hunger or a thirst, that motivating force.
Yeah.
So talk to us about women, because, you know, in our Gail's in my age group, more women are experiencing loss of this type And what can you, do you have anything in particular to offer women who are after 60 years or 30 years or
Yeah.
however long it is, have lost a husband or
Yeah.
a partner, a
Yeah.
child, adult child?
Absolutely. I think that for the most part, we see that women have bigger social networks in general than men, or especially older women have bigger social networks than older men. And this is actually a great source of resilience because while it is not the same as having your one and only, it can provide that support sort of around the experience that you're having that sort of can hold you, like that cast we were talking about, right? It can sort of hold you while you're healing and while you're coming to learn how to be in the world now. So this is one of the great, I think one of the great benefits of a lifetime of women being expected to have friendships, women being expected to attend to their emotional life. And, in the end, I think it can be really beneficial that we have those skills then when we do face loss. So that's one thing that
Yeah.
comes to mind.
Yeah. Yeah. I think
But
it's
I think it is also, I would just also add, sort of the flip side of that is that women have often defined themselves in terms of their caregiving roles.
Mhm.
And so the death of a loved one, whether that's a child or a sibling or a spouse, as you say, often cuts us off from that caregiving that we are so used to doing. And that can lead to the feeling of, I don't know who I am if this isn't what I'm doing day to day. And I think is an opportunity then for women to think about what other parts of their identity are really important to them. And also for those who really love caregiving, how else can I give care in this world, even though it's not to this one person that I've been bonded to for a long time?
Mhm.
Is there anything
Gail, I
else?
think I interrupted you. I'm sorry.
No, 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 no.
I was just wondering, is there anything else that you really wanted us to hear about or to have in mind before we have to close?
Well, this may sound silly. This is sort of my own. This goes beyond just being a scientist. So I know, right, all these things that are happening in the brain. But it actually also gives me some comfort in that I recognize that this person has physically impacted me, right? That I actually carry a piece of them in my brain. And I then perceive the world through this brain that's been, changed by who they were and who we were. And I find that enormously comforting somehow. So I offered that for people who might also resonate with that understanding.
Certainly gives more concrete meaning to the notion that we will always carry this person with us.
Yeah.
Literally,
Yeah,
we are carrying this person with us.
exactly. Yeah.
Wow. Well, what next for you and your work? Where's your work taking you?
Well, it's been very exciting. In writing this book, I really wanted to put this knowledge that science has generated into the hands of the individuals who could use it. And so it has meant that I have gotten to talk with a lot of people like the two of you, people who are working day to day in their own communities and their own families. And so finding other ways to really reach out, whether that might be developing a grief app, or whether that might be doing additional research to really understand the ways that we can intervene that make the most difference for people who are really struggling. Those are the kinds of studies I'd like to do going forward.
Interesting. Wow. Well,
It's
we
great
thank you.
work.
You want something else, Gail? Go ahead.
I was just going to say it's great work and important work. And, we see, as you do, all of the women who suffer losses in so many different ways. And this is important to have a conversation about this, to get it out,
Yes.
so that people can feel comfortable talking about it more than
That's
they,
right.
sometimes they want to stop at a certain, they say, okay, I've been grieving already for a year. I shouldn't be talking about this anymore. Well, some of the things that you've said here today, I think are very comforting to those who grieve, because you don't have to stop.
That's right. It continues to evolve.
That's right. It's always a part of you.
That's right. Yeah.
One of our other recent advocates is Dr. Pauline Boss, and she talks about the myth of closure, which is something that you alluded to as well.
Yeah.
That it's just getting over it, or closing things up. It's harmful.
Yeah.
Really harmful. Yeah, that your brain just can't do it. Doesn't need to.
It doesn't reflect people's lived experience. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Well, we will look forward to your app, your
Great.
grief app, and anything else you put out there for the public. We're really, really delighted to have you with us today, and thank you so much.
Thank you. And thanks for bringing this conversation to people.
It's our pleasure.
Thanks, Mary Frances.